The cold was a living thing. It had teeth that bit into the thin fabric of her tunic and claws that scraped against her bones. Alara had never known a cold like this, a cold that was not just an absence of heat, but an active, malicious presence. It lived in the stone walls of the fortress, in the iron of her shackles, and in the contemptuous eyes of the northern guards. She was a tribute, a piece of flesh and bone sent from the sun-drenched south to appease the perpetually frozen north. Her kingdom had lost the war generations ago, and every decade a tithe was paid. Grain, timber, gold, and people. Usually the people were skilled artisans or comely youths destined for noble houses. Alara was neither. She was a criminal. The brand on the inside of her left wrist, a stylized serpent, declared it to all. It was a mark of poison, of betrayal, a crime she had not committed, a punishment she would carry for the rest of her life. They had sent her here to die, a convenient way to dispose of a shameful problem. The head cook, a woman whose face seemed permanently chapped by the frost, shoved a bucket of icy water and a stiff brush into Alara's hands. The great hall floors, don't miss a single stone. The king might walk there. The words were a threat. The Alpha King of the North, Theron, was a creature of myth and terror. A warrior who had never lost a battle. A ruler who had reigned for centuries. His life unnaturally prolonged. They said he had ice in his veins. They said his heart was a shard of frozen rock. They said he never took a mate, for his bloodline was cursed. Alara's hands were already numb, the skin cracked and bleeding. She knelt on the flagstones, the cold seeping instantly through her threadbare trousers, a deep ache that shot straight to her hips. She dipped the brush in the bucket. The water felt like 1,000 tiny needles stabbing her skin. She focused on the motion. Scrub, dip, scrub. She didn't look up at the tapestries depicting ancient, bloody battles. She didn't look at the throne of carved ice and obsidian that sat empty at the far end of the hall. She looked only at the square of stone in front of her. This was her world now. This one stone, then the next. Worthless. The word was a constant echo in her mind, the final judgment passed by her father, the Duke, as he'd watched the royal guard press the hot iron to her skin. She had been framed by her own stepsister, accused of poisoning a rival suitor. Her father, valuing ambition over truth, had chosen to believe the lie. He had cast her out. So she scrubbed. She scrubbed away the dirt and grime, imagining she could scrub away the brand, the shame, the memory of a son she would never feel again. Here, in the crushing cold and silence, she was invisible. And invisibility was a form of safety. A sudden hush fell over the hall. The usual clatter from the kitchens, the distant shouts of guards in the bailey, all of it ceased. An unnatural silence descended, thick and heavy. Alara felt it before she heard it. A pressure in the air. The great doors at the end of the hall swung open, though no one had pushed them. 2 figures entered, but she only saw one. King Theron. He was larger than the legend suggested. A mountain of a man, clad in black furs and leather that seemed to absorb the light. His hair was the color of midnight, streaked with silver like moonlight on a frozen lake. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and absolute. The guards and servants who had been present moments before seemed to melt into the shadows, their heads bowed. Alara froze, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She had never seen him this close. His face was all harsh angles and brutal beauty, as if carved from the very glacier the fortress was built upon. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sky before a storm, a pale, piercing silver that seemed to see everything. His gaze swept the hall, dismissive and cold. It passed over her, and for a moment she could breathe again. He was just passing through. She was nothing. A smudge on the floor he was about to walk on. Then he stopped. He turned his head slowly, his silver eyes landing on her, on the pathetic, shivering girl kneeling in a puddle of dirty water. He saw her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She ducked her head, making herself smaller, hoping to vanish. "Don't see me. Please don't see me." His heavy boots made no sound on the stones as he approached. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so sharply that her breath plumed in a white cloud before her face. He stood over her, a towering shadow blotting out the dim light from the high windows. She trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer force of his presence. It was like standing at the foot of an avalanche, waiting to be buried. A hand, encased in a black leather glove, reached down. It was not directed at her. It was his companion, a slender man with clever, watchful eyes, Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor. "Your Majesty?" Valerius murmured, his voice smooth as oiled silk. The kitchen sent a new batch of tributes for the menial work. This one is from the south. The emphasis on her origin was a subtle insult. The king did not look at his advisor. His gaze remained fixed on Alara. He saw the way she flinched, the way she tried to hide her left hand beneath her right. Slowly, he crouched. The movement was fluid, powerful, and utterly terrifying. He was now at her level, the storm of his eyes just feet from her own. She could smell the scent of pine and cold, clean air clinging to his furs. It was the smell of the wilderness, of power. "Your hand," he said. His voice was not a shout. It was deeper than that. A low rumble, like the shifting of ancient ice. It was a command, not a request. Her terror was so complete it became a strange sort of calm. There was no escape. Slowly, trembling uncontrollably, she extended her right hand. He ignored it. His gaze was fixed on her other hand, the one she kept hidden. The other one. Her blood turned to slush. He knew. How could he know? She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear freezing on her lash. With a shuddering breath, she revealed her left wrist. The serpent brand was stark against her pale, cold-reddened skin. A mark of filth. A mark of shame. She waited for the disgust, the immediate dismissal, the order for her execution. Instead, he simply looked at it. His silver eyes traced the shape of the brand, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that shattered her reality. He reached out and removed his glove. His fingers were long and pale, his hand large and calloused. He gently took her wrist, his thumb brushing directly over the brand. The shock was twofold. First, the touch itself. No one had touched her with anything but violence or revulsion in years. Second, the cold. It was not the ambient cold of the castle. It was a profound, shocking cold that emanated from his very skin, a cold so deep it felt like a burn. It sank into her, a wave of absolute frost that made her gasp. But beneath the shocking cold, something else happened. A flicker. A tiny, impossible spark of warmth deep within her own core. A startled ember stirring in response to the ice. It was gone as quickly as it came. He felt it. She knew he did. His silver eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something. Shock? Recognition? Crossing his frozen features. His grip tightened for a fraction of a second before he released her as if burned. He stood abruptly, turning away from her. The warmth, if it had ever been there, was gone, leaving only the memory of his glacial touch and the phantom ache in her wrist. "This one," he said, his back to her. The words echoed in the vast, silent hall. "She will be moved to the royal wing. She will tend the library." Lord Valerius stared, his smooth composure cracking for the first time. "Your Majesty? She is a branded criminal. Unskilled. From the south. She is meant for the scullery." The king turned his head just enough to pin his advisor with a look of pure Arctic menace. The temperature in the hall dropped another 10 degrees. "I was not asking for your counsel, Valerius," Theron said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. I was giving an order. Valerius paled and bowed his head low. Yes, Your Majesty. Theron's gaze swept back to Alara one last time. There was no softness in it, no kindness, only an unreadable, possessive intensity. Then he turned and walked away, his dark cloak swirling behind him like a storm cloud. Alara remained kneeling on the floor, shivering in a puddle of freezing water, her world completely upended. The most powerful man alive, a king feared by all, had looked at her, the worthless, branded girl, and had not seen filth. He had seen something else, and that, she realized with a dawning terror, was far more dangerous than being invisible. Her new quarters were a cell, albeit a luxurious one. They were adjacent to the royal library, a vast cavernous space filled with the scent of old paper and leather. The room was small, containing a narrow bed with a thick fur blanket, a small wash basin, and a single, high window that looked out onto a sheer drop of ice-slicked rock. It was warmer here than in the lower levels, but the chill was still pervasive. It was in her bones. A guard brought her a simple meal of bread and stew, along with a set of plain, dark wool clothes that were infinitely better than her old rags. No one spoke to her. They just left the items and retreated, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. She was the king's new pet. A strange curiosity he had plucked from the grime. She knew it wouldn't last. His interest would wane, and she would be cast back down, or worse. The first day, she did not see him. She spent the hours in the library, a place so quiet you could hear the dust motes dance in the slivers of pale light. The task was simple: catalog the scrolls on the eastern wall. Her hands shook as she handled the brittle parchment. She could read, a skill her father had insisted upon before he had disowned her. It was a small comfort in this vast, lonely place. That night she huddled under the fir, listening to the wind howl outside her window. It sounded like a mournful wolf. Sleep was a skittish thing, refusing to settle. Then she heard it. A low sound from the hallway outside her door. Not the wind. This was deeper, more guttural. A growl. Her heart leaped into her throat. She sat bolt upright, straining her ears. It came again, a rumbling threat that vibrated through the stone floor. A beast was outside her door. She slid from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Fear warred with a desperate curiosity. Who would leave a wolf to guard a servant's door? She crept closer, her eye pressing to the small crack between the door and the frame. She could only see a patch of white, a massive shape of white fur blocking the light from the sconce down the hall. It was a wolf. Larger than any wolf she had ever imagined, its fur the color of fresh snow. It was curled up on the flagstones, its great head resting on its paws. As she watched, it shifted, a low snarl escaping its throat in its sleep. It was guarding her, and it was warning her away at the same time. Every night was the same. She would work in the silent library. A tray of food would appear outside her door, and as darkness fell, the great white wolf would arrive, settling in for its vigil, its presence both a comfort and a terrifying mystery. She never saw it arrive or leave. It was just there. A week passed. She saw the king only once, a fleeting glimpse of him walking down a distant corridor, flanked by guards. He didn't look her way. Perhaps he had already forgotten her. The thought brought a strange, sharp pang of disappointment. One evening, she was working late in the library trying to decipher a particularly faded script. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, the familiar sign of his approach. She looked up to see him standing in the arched doorway, watching her. He was not in his furs and leathers. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, looking less like a king and more like a warrior at rest. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "You can read the old tongue," he stated. It wasn't a question. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her voice was a mouse's squeak. He walked toward her, his steps silent. He stopped beside her table, looking down at the scroll she was working on. This is a history of the first men, their pact with the winter spirits. I was just trying to preserve it, she stammered, afraid she had overstepped. The ink is fading. I know, he said. He looked at her then, his silver eyes intense. Why were you branded? The question was a physical blow. She flinched, instinctively covering her wrist. For treason, Your Majesty, for poisoning a nobleman. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but the truth was too dangerous. A muscle feathered in his jaw. You are a poor liar. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. He knew. I do not care what crime the fools in the South accused you of, he continued, his voice low and cold. I care why you are here. I care what you are. I am nothing, she whispered, the old familiar shame washing over her. A tribute. A servant. No, he said, the word absolute. He reached out, his bare hand hovering just inches from her cheek. The air between his skin and hers crackled with an impossible cold. She could feel it, a tangible force. You are not nothing. He let his hand drop, turning away from her. The scrolls are fragile. The library is too cold. I will have a fire lit in the main hearth each evening. And with that, he was gone. A fire. No one lit fires in the library. The risk to the ancient books was too great. But the next evening, a servant came and lit a small, contained fire in the massive stone hearth, the flames casting flickering, warm shadows on the towering shelves. Alara sat near it, soaking in a warmth she hadn't felt since she'd left her homeland. It was a small kindness, an impossible gesture from an impossible man. He began to visit her there, in the quiet of the night. He would not speak at first. He would simply stand by the fire, staring into the flames, a solitary, lonely figure. The great white wolf was never present when he was. The connection was obvious, but her mind refused to fully grasp it. A man who could become a beast. A king who slept outside her door in the form of a monster. She started talking, her voice soft in the vast silence. She told him about the scrolls she was reading, about the histories of his own people. She never spoke of herself, of her past. He listened, his silver eyes fixed on the fire, but she knew he heard every word. One night she found a book left on her table. It was a collection of Southern poetry, bound in soft leather. There was no note. She knew it was from him. Her heart ached with a confused, burgeoning hope. Why her? The question haunted her waking moments and her dreams. What did he see in her? She started to see past his mask. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the way his hand would clench into a fist, as if fighting a constant internal battle. He was a man locked in a cage of his own making. One evening, he was late. The fire was burning low when he finally appeared in the doorway. He looked wrong. His face was paler than usual, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the chill. He leaned against the doorframe, his breathing shallow. Your Majesty? She asked, rising to her feet. Are you unwell? It is nothing, he bit out, his voice strained. He pushed himself upright and walked toward the fire, but his steps were unsteady. He held his hands out to the flames, but they seemed to offer him no warmth. She saw it then. A delicate, crystalline pattern of frost creeping across the back of his hand, like ice forming on a window pane. It spread from his knuckles to his wrist before he snatched his hand back, clenching it into a fist and hiding it in the folds of his tunic. The curse. She had read about it in a forbidden text she'd found hidden in a loose wallstone. The royal bloodline of the North was bound to winter. They drew power from it, but it came at a cost. The curse of the frost-souled kings. They could not feel love. The emotion was poison to them, turning the ice in their veins from a source of strength into a fatal creeping frost that would freeze them from the inside out. He was feeling something for her, and it was killing him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a game. His kindness, his attention, the wolf at her door, it was all a death sentence. For him. "You should not be here," she said, her voice trembling. "You should send me away." His head snapped toward her, his silver eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. "No. It's me," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I am doing this to you. I am the poison they said I was." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. His touch, even through the wool of her tunic, was so cold it burned. The frost was on his skin. She could feel it. "You are not poison," he growled, his face inches from hers. "You are fire, and I have been cold for so long." His expression was one of agony, a war between desire and self-preservation. For a moment she thought he would kiss her. The thought was both terrifying and electrifying, but then he recoiled, shoving her away from him with a pained gasp. He staggered back, clutching his chest. The frost on his hand had spread up his arm, a beautiful, deadly lacework of ice visible on his pale skin. "Stay away from me," he snarled, the words a desperate plea. He turned and fled from the library, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the horrifying truth. Her hope turned to ash. To be near him was to kill him. To be wanted by him was to be his executioner. The wolf's snarl at her door suddenly made a terrible, heartbreaking kind of sense. It wanted to be near her, but it knew she was death. The king's visit stopped. The castle grew colder, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. A chill of fear and suspicion radiated from the throne and infected everyone. Theron became more ruthless, more distant than ever before. He handed down harsh judgments in the court, his voice devoid of any emotion, but icy disdain. He was pushing her away. He was trying to kill the feelings he had for her to save his own life. Alara understood. It didn't make it hurt any less. Every glance she caught of him was a fresh wound. The deepening shadows under his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw, the way he now always wore gloves. Lord Valerius, however, seemed to thrive in the new, frigid climate. His influence over the king grew. He was always at Theron's side, his voice a constant, soothing murmur. Alara saw the way the advisor looked at her when the king wasn't watching, a look of triumphant hatred. He knew. Valerius knew what was happening, and he was using it. Whispers followed her through the corridors. The branded whore, the southern witch. They said she had ensnared the king with dark magic, that she was draining his life force. The servants who had once ignored her now openly sneered. The guards watched her with undisguised hostility. One day, as she was returning to her room, Valerius blocked her path. "The king's health is failing," he said, his voice a silken threat. "His strength wanes. The winter in his blood is turning against him." "I don't know what you're talking about," Alara said, her voice shaking. Valerius smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Oh, I think you do. You are the source of this illness, a poison sent by your people to finish the work their armies could not. But your little plot is over." He was framing her, just like her stepsister had. The pattern was so sickeningly familiar. "He will never believe you," she said, trying to find a strength she did not feel. "He won't have to," Valerius replied smoothly. "When he is weak enough, the council will listen to reason. And reason dictates that the source of a poison must be eliminated." The threat was clear. He wasn't just going to have her sent away, he was going to have her killed. That night, the growl from outside her door was weaker, laced with a pained whine. When she peered through the crack, the great white wolf was trembling, its breath fogging in ragged pants. A fine layer of frost coated its magnificent fur. It was suffering. He was suffering. A few days later, the king summoned her. Not to the library, but to the throne room. The hall was filled with the stony-faced lords and ladies of the northern court. Lord Valerius stood at the king's right hand. Theron sat on his throne of ice and obsidian, looking like a statue carved from the glacier itself. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but she could see the truth. The skin around his eyes was tight with pain, and the silver of his irises seemed dull, clouded. "Ilara of the Southern Dukedom," he said, his voice formal and echoing in the cavernous room. It held none of the warmth she'd heard in the library. It was the voice of a judge. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. "Your service in the library is no longer required," he stated, his gaze boring into her. "The arrangement has proven to be a mistake." A collective sigh of relief and satisfaction rippled through the court. Valerius allowed himself a small, triumphant smirk. "You will be returned to the kitchens," the king continued, his voice dropping, becoming harder. "You will not leave the lower levels. You will not speak to anyone above the rank of servant. If I see your face again, I will have it removed." The cruelty of the words was a physical slap. He was severing the tie. He was saving himself. And he was using cruelty as the knife. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him, or this hateful court, the satisfaction. She bowed her head, her hair falling to hide her face. "Yes, Your Majesty." She turned and walked from the throne room, each step an agony. She could feel his eyes on her back, a cold, desperate weight. She did not look back. The kitchens were worse than before. The head cook, emboldened by the king's public rejection, worked Ilara to the bone. Her hands, which had begun to heal in the dry warmth of the library, were once again raw and bleeding. The cold was her constant companion, a shroud she could not escape. But the worst part was the silence outside her new door. A tiny, drafty closet in the servants' wing. The wolf did not come. The nights were empty, filled only with the howling of the wind and the aching of her own heart. He was gone. The guard was gone. The monster was gone. She was truly alone again. Worthless. Invisible. Just as she'd always been. The days bled into a gray, frozen twilight. Ilara moved through her chores in a fog of grief, her body aching, her spirit numb. The whispers about the king's failing health grew louder. They said he rarely left his chambers. They said the frost was consuming him. One afternoon, a frantic energy seized the castle. Guards ran through the corridors, their voices sharp with alarm. A council meeting had been called, and then abruptly ended. The king had collapsed. The news spread through the kitchens like wildfire. He had fallen in the middle of the council chamber, his body rigid, a layer of ice forming over his skin and clothes. The royal healers were powerless, their potions and poultices freezing before they could even be applied. Lord Valerius had taken control. His voice rang through the castle, declaring a state of emergency, and Ilara knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than any winter wind, what would come next. It didn't take long. 2 of Valerius's personal guards found her scrubbing a pot in the scullery. They didn't speak. They simply grabbed her arms, their grips like iron bands. "The Southern Witch!" one of them snarled. "You're finished!" They dragged her through the castle, up winding stone stairs she was forbidden to climb. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a different feeling was stirring. A hot, furious rage. They were blaming her for this. Valerius was going to murder the king and use her as his excuse. They threw her into an ice cell, a dungeon carved directly into the glacier beneath the fortress. The air was so cold it was difficult to breathe. There was no bed, no blanket, only a slick, frozen floor and the crushing darkness. "Lord Valerius has declared you a curse witch," the guard sneered through the bars. "Your presence is killing the king. Your execution is set for dawn. It is the only way to sever the bond and save him." The heavy door slammed shut, the bolt driving home with a sound of finality. She was left in the freezing dark. This was how she would die, framed for a crime she didn't commit. Again. Her life was a repeating tragedy. She slid down the icy wall, her body racked with shivers. She thought of Theron. of the tormented kindness in his eyes, of the wolf who guarded her door. He was dying, and they were going to kill her for it. Despair was a heavy cloak, but as the hours passed, something else took its place. Defiance. She would not die like this. She would not let Valerius win. She would not let Theron die alone. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard a faint scraping sound at the door. Not the heavy tread of the guards. Lighter. Quicker. The bolt slid back. The door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim torchlight of the corridor. It was a young guard, one she had seen sometimes near the library. He had always had kind eyes. "I don't believe him," the guard whispered, his voice urgent. "I don't believe you're the poison. I saw the way the king looked at you, and I saw the way Valerius looked at you." He pressed a heavy fur cloak into her hands. "Go. The king is in his chambers. Valerius has him under guard, but they think you're secure. This may be your only chance." "Thank you," she breathed, her voice hoarse. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped the cloak around her shoulders and ran. She knew the way, her heart guiding her through the maze of corridors. The castle was eerily quiet, the attention of its residents focused on the drama of the throne. She reached the royal wing. Two of Valerius's men stood outside the king's chambers. They saw her, and their eyes widened in shock, hands immediately going to their swords. Alara didn't stop. She ran straight at them. She was no fighter, but her desperation gave her a reckless strength. She slammed her shoulder into one of the guards, knocking him off balance just as the other drew his blade. She dodged under his swing, her hand finding the heavy iron handle of the door. She threw her weight against it, bursting into the room. The sight that greeted her stopped her breath. The vast chamber was unnaturally cold, every surface coated in a thick layer of rime. In the center of the room, on the massive bed, lay King Theron. He was encased in a cocoon of shimmering, supernatural ice, his skin pale blue, his lips colorless. His chest was still. He looked like a king entombed in crystal. Beside the bed, its form flickering and translucent, lay the great white wolf. It was motionless, its ethereal body fading in and out of existence. Lord Valerius stood near the hearth, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. "So, the little rat escapes her trap. It matters not. You are too late." "What have you done?" Alara whispered, horror stealing her voice. "I have done what was necessary," Valerius said, stepping toward her. "The king was weakened by your presence. I merely hastened the inevitable. The council has already granted me the regency. Once he is gone, I will be king. And you will be the witch who murdered him." The guards from the hall burst in behind her, swords drawn. They advanced on her, their faces grim. But Alara wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Theron. Through the crystalline ice she saw a flicker of movement. An eyelid. His lips parted, and a barely audible puff of frost escaped. Alara. She didn't hear it with her ears. She felt it. A whisper directly into her soul, a desperate final call. The guards grabbed her arms. Their touch was rough, pulling her back toward the door, toward her death. "No," she said. The word was quiet, a mere breath. But it was filled with a power she had never known. "No," she said again, louder this time. She planted her feet, resisting their pull. The rage she had felt in the dungeon, the grief from the lonely nights, the desperate, impossible love she felt for the dying man on the bed, it all coalesced inside her. It was a fire. She ripped her arms from the guard's grasp with a strength that was not her own. She stumbled toward the bed, her eyes locked on Theron's frozen form. "Get her!" Valerius shrieked, his composure finally breaking. But she didn't care. She reached the bed, her hands hovering over the ice that encased his chest. It was colder than anything she had ever felt, a cold that promised only death and oblivion. She would not let him go. She pressed her hands against the ice. She thought of the sun. She thought of the warmth of her homeland, a warmth she had carried as a phantom memory. She thought of the small fire in the library, a gift from him. She focused all her will, all her being, on that warmth. She called to it, begged for it, demanded it. A faint orange light flickered in her palms, reflecting off the ice. Valerius and his guards stopped, their eyes wide with disbelief. The light grew. It was not a reflection. It was coming from her. A deep, primal heat bloomed in her chest, a furnace igniting after a lifetime of dormancy. It surged down her arms and into her hands. With a sound like 1,000 shattering mirrors, a wave of incandescent heat erupted from her palms. It was not fire that burned. It was pure, liquid warmth, a golden light that blasted outwards. The guards were thrown back against the walls, crying out in shock. Valerius shielded his eyes, stumbling away with a hiss. The light poured from her, not into the room, but into the ice. It didn't melt the crystal shell. It flowed into it, suffusing it with a golden glow. The supernatural frost, a creature of pure cold, could not bear it. It began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface, lit from within by her power. She pushed more, sobbing now, not from pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of what was happening. She was a conduit for a sun that had been hidden inside her. The brand on her wrist, the serpent, glowed with a fierce white-hot light, the dark ink burning away until only clean skin remained. The ice cocoon shattered. It didn't melt into water. It sublimated into a cloud of glittering dust that was instantly evaporated by the wave of warmth radiating from her. Theron gasped, a huge shuddering intake of air. His eyes flew open. The cloudy silver was gone, replaced by a brilliant molten gold that mirrored the light pouring from her hands. He stared up at her, his face filled with awe and recognition. "You," he breathed, his voice raw. The light from her hands softened, the inferno receding to a gentle, steady glow. She collapsed forward, her energy spent, her head landing on his chest. She could feel it. The steady, strong beat of his heart, and beneath her cheek, his skin was not cold, it was warm. She lay there listening to the miracle of his heartbeat, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the power she had unleashed. The room was warm, the frost gone from every surface. The air smelled of ozone and summer. Theron's hand, his wonderfully, impossibly warm hand, came up to cup the back of her head. His fingers tangled gently in her hair. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. She pushed herself up, looking at him. The deadly pallor was gone, replaced by the flush of life. His eyes, now a vibrant gold, held hers. He was looking at her not as a servant, not as a criminal, not even as a savior. He was looking at her as if she were the other half of his soul. From the corner of the room, Lord Valerius stared, his face a mask of horror and thwarted ambition. "Witchcraft!" he spat, pointing a trembling finger at her. "She has possessed him. Seize her!" The guards, still dazed, hesitated. They looked from their furious regent to the king, who was now sitting up in bed, his arm protectively around Ilara. Theron's gaze shifted to Valerius. The gold in his eyes cooled to a hard, dangerous sheen. "You were